Okay, howdy. My name is Nicholas Max Valadez. Here is my keyword outline. It has the quotes in there that I have too. Then there's the second page. Additionally, I have my phone to serve as my timer, which I'll start when I start. And then the only other thing I have is my mouse, which is going to be used to control the PowerPoint. So it shouldn't be news to any of us that the 2020 election has motivated voters of all ages and backgrounds to show up to the polls. But up until this year, Texas really hasn't had the voter turnout to impress me or really the rest of the country. It's been abysmal. Why is that? You know, in order to increase voter turnout and engage more voters in our country's democracy, the state of Texas really needs to move towards systems like automatic voter registration, as well as early voting periods being extended in order to encourage more people to vote. So I like to say that everything is bigger in Texas, just like we do, except voter turnout. Today, we're going to talk about a few different things. First, we're going to talk about Texas's history as a non-voting state. Then we're going to discuss automatic voter registration and longer early vote periods that could increase voter turnout. And finally, we're going to end with why increasing voter turnout in Texas will benefit voters and give their voice power in democracy. So historically, Texas has been, a non-voting state for a long time. Many people have said that it's a traditionally red state, but in reality, I believe, as well as many others, that it truly is a purple state. So Texas struggles with low voter turnout, and we know that. And as a result, we have one of the least politically engaged populations in the country. Historically, Texas lags behind in voter turnout compared to other states around the country. Some contribute this to it being more difficult to vote in Texas, or just a lack of interest in statewide and federal candidates. In fact, decades of political science tells us that income, education, ethnicity, age, and a history of voting are the best predictors of whether someone will vote. This means that as we look at voters that have historically not voted in the state of Texas, we can pretty much predict what they're going to do. Because if they haven't voted in the past and they haven't been motivated to do so back then, they're most likely not going to be so in the future. So how do we fix that? Well, this information that I just told you comes from an article back in 2010 from Forrest Wilder. He's a contributor over at the Texas Observer, and he referenced voting data that is publicly available to make these points. Texas can also be considered a traditionalistic state, and that can be a reason that we have such low voter turnout. According to Smith and Greenblatt in their political science textbook, Governing States and Localities, I'm going to read this quote directly from because I want to make sure that everyone understands it. Traditionalistic states believe the larger purpose of government is to maintain the existing social order. Those at the top of the social structure are expected to play a dominant role in politics, and power is concentrated in the hands of these elites. In short, Texans and Texas voters just don't really value politics in general. They believe that it should be left up to the elites more so than everyday citizens. In comparison, other states with high voter turnout tend to be what is called a moralistic or traditionalistic state. Now, let's go into a definition of what these things mean. And we're going to move on to the next slide before we do that as well. So a moralistic state is a state kind of like somewhere like Minnesota, Washington State, or some states in the Northeast that really place a high emphasis on public office and public servants in their community. From a young age, students are told how important it is to be involved civically, and why being a politician is seen as a really good thing there is because it does a service to a community. Moving on to individualistic states, these are states like California, some states out in the west of the United States like Nevada and Arizona that really think that the government does have a job playing a role in your life, but they shouldn't go too far. So again, Texas falls into that traditionalistic category. That means we have one of the least politically engaged groups of voters in the country. So let's move on to some ideas of how we can change this lack of voter turnout in our state. So the first thing we're going to talk about is automatic voter registration. So we're going to use the case of the state of Oregon. Oregon is a state that enacted automatic voter registration, which means that when you turn 18 years old, you are automatically registered to vote. You know, we can talk about the impact of this, and the best way to do that is from real world data. For example, and I'll open the quote here. Since Oregon became the first state in the nation to implement automatic voter registration in 2016, the Beaver State has seen registration rates quadruple at DMV offices. In the first 6 months after automatic voter registration was implemented in Vermont on New Year's Day 2017, registration rates jumped 62% when compared to the first half of 2016. And that information comes from the Brennan Center, which advocates for law and public policy. In fact, online voter registration and kind of that same system of automatic voter registration is already being seen in Texas. A court ruling ruled that Texans who are updating their driver's license this year would be allowed to register to vote past the registration period. So we're already seeing cases of this in Texas as well. Just recently, there's been concerns from some about automatic voters registration as well, and the effect it really can have on voter turnout. In an article published in the academic journal Political Behavior, Walker, Heron, and Smith noted that we find little evidence that changes to early opportunities in North Carolina had uniform effects on voter turnout. So basically what they're saying is, we have these methods like automatic voter registration and early voting periods that have been extended because of COVID or other circumstances, but we really haven't seen that much of a change in the research that we've done, is what they're saying essentially. Now, it's obvious that there's conflicting data here, so we really have to take everything with a grain of salt when we advocate for one side or the other. So longer early voting periods, though, have increased voter turnout, at least in observations from this year. For example, here in Texas, according to an article published by Garrison in 2020, through the first 8 days of early voting in Texas, 801,000 people voted in Harris County, which is the Houston area, eclipsing 93% of the county's 2016 early voting total. I believe that it should be common sense that the more time someone has to vote, the more likely they're actually going to go out and exercise their civic duty and go cast their ballot. Later on in the same article, Garrison discusses how this early voting expansion had made Texas, which, as we know, consistently ranks towards the bottom in voting ranks, ground zero for this year's early voting explosion in the presidential election. So it's clear that automatic voter registration and early voting periods being extended could have a massive impact on how many voters actually turn out in the Lone Star State. But what does this mean if we increase all these things? Well, for one, when we increase voter turnout, we increase the voice of the people. This makes people who historically are sick of their government and don't think they do anything know that they are making an impact on the results of the election. Many people have historically been discouraged from participating in their local democracy because they feel like their voice isn't heard and that they can't make an impact. But I like to think of a quote from the late Congressman John Lewis, who was a voting rights advocate as well as a civil rights advocate. And he says that the vote is the most powerful non-violent tool that we have to make a change. If we really want more effective governments, we need to show up to the polls and demand for our politicians to be accountable and listen to us as citizens. Higher turnout states tend to have more satisfaction from governments. Like we mentioned earlier, moralistic states like those up north, like Minnesota, tend to have more satisfaction with their governments because they have to be more politically engaged to satisfy their citizens. We do have some hope right now in Texas, as early voting numbers have completely eclipsed what they've been in recent years. Noting some statistics that are very well common knowledge right now with a quick Google search, the youth vote, so those aged from 18 to about 39, is up over 600% this year with the longer early voting periods and efforts to register more voters. So in conclusion, and as we wrap things up, we've talked about Texas's historical problem with a low voter turnout. Then we pivoted and talked about a couple of the different solutions like automatic voter registration and longer early vote periods that could lead to a more active electorate. And finally, we talked about what this could mean for voters. This means that we can be more engaged, have politicians be more accountable, and really fighting for change in Washington and in state politics like in Austin for the people of us. So we must move forward. And I believe that everyone wants more people to be able to vote. Everyone wants people to be able to practice their constitutional right. And I believe that through the methods that I presented today, that you should advocate for these policies of automatic voter registration and longer early voting periods as well. This is what we did today, is we went over these things. Thank you.